My mom humiliated me at my wedding, so I ruined her perfect image. There are moments in life that split everything into a before and after. Moments so sharp, so unexpected, that when you try to remember them later, they don't feel like memories. They feel like wounds. June 14th, 2019. The reception hall at the Elmwood Country Club in Dayton, Ohio. 212 guests. White floral arrangements on every table. Candles still flickering. My wife Sarah's hand in mine, warm and trembling just a little from happiness. And then the microphone feedback screech that pulled the room to silence. My mother stood up. She was wearing a deep burgundy dress. Her hair perfectly curled. Her jewelry deliberate. She had spent weeks planning this moment and I didn't know it yet. She smiled at the crowd. And then, for the next 4 minutes and 32 seconds, I counted them later from the video, she dismantled me. In front of everyone I loved. In front of Sarah's family, who I was still trying to impress. In front of my colleagues. In front of people who would remember this night for years.
She didn't yell.
She didn't cry. She smiled the entire time. That was the part one couldn't get over. The smile. What happened in those 4 minutes would start something I never intended to start. A quiet, slow, patient process that would take 18 months and end with my mother standing in front of the same community she had spent 30 years building, with nothing left to stand on. But here's what you need to understand first. This story isn't really about revenge. It's about what happens when someone finally stops letting a person rewrite the truth. To understand what happened at that wedding, you have to understand Millbrook Street. That's the street I grew up on, in a suburb of Dayton that was the kind of place where everyone waved to each other from their driveways and brought casseroles when someone's husband died. Green lawns. Quiet mornings. Church bells at 8 a.m. on Sundays that you could hear from 3 blocks away if your windows were open. My mother, Patricia and Mercer, had lived on Millbrook Street since 1987. She had been the block captain for 11 of those years. She had organized the 4th of July block parties, the back-to-school supply drives, the Christmas cookie exchanges. She sat on the board of St. Andrew's Community Church. She was, by every outward measure, the kind of woman people described as a pillar. That word gets used a lot. Pillar. It implies something solid, something load-bearing, something the whole structure depends on. Growing up, I believed it too. My dad, Robert, worked long hours at a manufacturing plant. He was a quiet man, gentle, the kind of person who fixed things on weekends and didn't ask for much. When I was 11, he moved out. The official story, the one my mother told neighbors, was that they had simply grown apart. Irreconcilable differences. She said it the same way she said everything, with a calm, practiced sadness that invited sympathy, without demanding it. I was never told what really happened. Not then. After the divorce, my mother's public image didn't just survive. It flourished. She was the devoted single mother now. She joined the PTA at Jefferson Middle School. She started volunteering with the Dayton Women's Coalition. By the time I was in high school, she had been featured twice in the local Gazette. Once for organizing a food drive that collected over 4,000 pounds of canned goods. Once for receiving a community service award from the county. Her photograph was framed and hanging in the hallway of St. Andrew's. I was proud of her. For a long time, I was genuinely proud. But there was always this thing that lived underneath the pride. This low, quiet hum I couldn't name. The way she would correct me in front of people and call it keeping you humble. The way she would share my failures at dinner parties as amusing anecdotes. The way she would smile when she did it, that same smile, as if the embarrassment she was causing me was somehow a kindness she was doing for the room. I told myself it wasn't intentional.
For 28 years, I told myself that.
Then came June 14th. And the microphone. And the smile. The video was recorded by a guest named Marcus, a college friend of mine who had been sitting near the front. He didn't mean to capture the whole thing. He started filming because he thought it was going to be a normal wedding toast and wanted to send it to a mutual friend who couldn't make the trip. He captured all 4 minutes and 32 seconds. In those 4 minutes, my mother told the room that she had always worried I wasn't ready for marriage. She said it gently, with that practiced sadness. She told the story of the time I forgot to pay my electric bill in my first apartment and sat in the dark for 3 days rather than ask for help, a story I had told her in confidence during a difficult month. She brought up the job I had been laid off from in 2016, framing it as evidence of a pattern she had prayed about often. She said she hoped Sarah knew what she was taking on, and she said it looking directly at Sarah's mother. Then she raised her glass and said, "To Daniel, may he finally figure it out." The room laughed.
Not a lot of them.
Maybe 30 or 40 people who thought it was dry humor, the way some families joke at weddings. But 30 or 40 people laughing in a room of 212 is enough to hollow you out. Sarah squeezed my hand so hard I felt it in my wrist. By Monday morning, some of the guests had talked. The way people do. By Tuesday, I had received 2 text messages from extended family members. One from a cousin named Jim who called it classic Aunt Patty. She's always been like that. And one from my mother's sister who said my mother had just been nervous and meant well. By Wednesday, the narrative was already being shaped. My mother had been clumsy, perhaps, but harmless, loving in her own way. And that's where it would have ended if it had been about anything other than what I had seen in her eyes during those 4 minutes. Because here is what the video couldn't capture and what I couldn't stop thinking about. She wasn't nervous. There was no tremor in her voice, no flush in her face. She was completely, entirely calm. She knew exactly what she was saying. She had prepared it. I replayed the video 9 times over the next week. Each time I noticed something new. The way she glanced at certain guests before delivering certain lines, gauging their reactions. The way she paused at exactly the right moment. The way the smile never reached her eyes. This wasn't nervousness. This was architecture. I should tell you something about who I am because it matters for what comes next. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't make scenes. I've never been the person who storms out of rooms or sends long angry emails or posts anything personal online. I'm an engineer. I work in structural analysis, which means at its core, my entire professional life is about finding the places where things are weakest before they fail. I grew up quiet, middle height, average build, the kind of face that people forget in crowds. I was never the best student, never the worst. I got into Ohio State on my own and graduated in the middle of my class and got a job at a mid-sized civil engineering firm in Columbus called Haverford and Associates, where I had been working for 4 years by the time I got married. I was good at my job in the particular way that doesn't announce itself, not flashy, but reliable. The kind of work that doesn't get celebrated until something doesn't break. My colleagues, if you asked them to describe me, would probably say, thorough, maybe patient. Sarah had used the word methodical on our 3rd date, and I had laughed and said it made me sound like a spreadsheet. She said she meant it as a compliment. That was the moment I knew I was going to marry her. So when the wedding happened and those 4 minutes happened, I didn't do what some people would have done. I didn't confront my mother in the parking lot. I didn't post the video online. I didn't call her the next day with shaking hands and an ultimatum. I did what I always do when I encounter something that doesn't add up. I started collecting data. What almost no one in my mother's world knew was something I had never spoken about publicly. For the past 3 years, quietly and without any particular plan, I had been keeping records. Not obsessively. Not with malicious intent. Just the way an engineer keeps records, because you never know when a load-bearing detail will matter. What those records contained would eventually become the entire story. When I was 24, something happened that started the whole thing. I was having dinner with my father, one of our monthly dinners, which we had resumed carefully after years of careful distance, and he mentioned something offhandedly about a property dispute from the early 2000s involving my mother and a neighbor named Gerald Whitmore. He didn't say it like it was significant. He said it the way people mention old weather. But I remembered the name Gerald Whitmore because I had heard it once when I was 9 years old, whispered through a closed kitchen door in a tone I had never heard my father use before or since. That night I went home and I started looking. Not with any agenda. Just because I was the kind of person who, once something didn't add up, couldn't leave it alone. What I found, through public property records and county court archives, was a civil complaint filed in 2003 by Gerald Whitmore against Patricia Mercer, alleging that she had misrepresented the boundary line of their adjoining properties to a contractor in a way that resulted in a fence being built 18 inches onto the Whitmore land. The case had been settled quietly. There was no judgment on record. Gerald Whitmore had moved away from Millbrook Street in 2004. It was not, in isolation, a damning thing. Neighbors dispute property lines all the time. But I noted it. I kept the document. Over the following months, I found other things. Not through any dramatic investigation, just through the normal accumulation of publicly available information, the kind of thing that sits in county databases and church newsletters and old newspaper archives, waiting for someone patient enough to look. I found the minutes from a 2008 St. Andrew's Church Board meeting, available on their website as part of a transparency initiative they had adopted and then quietly abandoned. In those minutes was a note about a discretionary fund discrepancy of approximately $1,800 and a motion to table further discussion pending a review by the Finance Committee.
My mother was on the board at the time.
The review appeared nowhere in subsequent minutes. The matter was simply never mentioned again. I found a letter to the editor of the Dayton Gazette from 2011, signed by a woman named Carolyn Fitch, which was critical of the Women's Coalition's management of a fundraising gala, specifically regarding the allocation of proceeds. Carolyn Fitch had resigned from the coalition 4 months later. My mother had been the gala's lead organizer. I found 3 other incidents over the following 2 years. Each one small. Each one, in isolation, explainable. But together, when you laid them side by side, they began to form a shape. My mother was meticulous about her public image. She managed it the way a skilled contractor manages a site, knowing where every inspection was scheduled, knowing which corners could be cut without being seen. She had been doing it for 30 years, and she had never been caught because she never made the same mistake twice, and she always had a story ready, and she told the story with the same calm, practiced warmth that made people want to believe her. What happened at my wedding was not an aberration. It was the same pattern, turned on me. In front of an audience she calculated was safe. And the thing about patterns is, once you know what shape they make, you can predict where they're going next. Here's where it gets complicated. And here's where most people, if they're honest, would have stopped. My mother's reputation was not just her vanity. It was structural. It was load-bearing, in a literal sense. She chaired the fundraising committee for St. Andrew's Community Outreach Program, which served about 340 families in the area with food assistance, school supplies, and utility bill help. She was the chairwoman of the Neighborhood Association's Disaster Relief Fund. She had co-signed on a grant application for the Dayton Women's Coalition, a grant worth $62,000 that was pending final approval. If I went to these institutions with my documents and said, "Look at this pattern, look at what I think she's been doing," I wasn't just targeting my mother. I was potentially pulling a support structure out from under hundreds of people who depended on what she had built, or what she had built her reputation on. That was the knot I sat with for 6 months after the wedding.
Sarah knew I was thinking about it.
She didn't push. She understood, in the way she always understands things, that I needed to find my own answer. But she said one thing in October 2019, sitting at our kitchen table on a Sunday morning, that I kept coming back to. She said, "The question isn't what happens to her reputation. The question is what's actually happening to those people right now while you're waiting." That reframing changed everything. Because I had been thinking about it as a choice between exposing my mother and protecting the community. But what if it was the other way around? What if the community was only safe if someone looked at what was actually happening underneath? I went back to the St. Andrew's Finance Committee minutes. I dug deeper this time. The church had adopted a new accounting software in 2016, and their annual reports were now published online with significantly more detail than they had been before. I spent 3 weekends comparing figures across 5 years of reports. The discretionary fund that had appeared in the 2008 meeting minutes had been restructured and renamed in 2014. My mother had remained involved in its oversight. The numbers, across multiple report years, showed a consistent pattern of expenditures categorized under administrative coordination that appeared to increase significantly in the months surrounding major external fundraising events. The amounts individually were never large enough to trigger any obvious alarm. $45 here, $230 there. But across 5 years and 11 events, the pattern accumulated to just under $9,000. $9,000 in a community assistance fund is not abstract money. It's food. It's school supplies. It's someone's heating bill in January. But a pattern of numbers is not proof of anything. I knew that. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an auditor. And here was the second, more complicated problem. The person best positioned to look at this was someone inside the institution who already trusted my mother. What I needed was a bridge. And I had no idea yet where to find one. The breakthrough came from the most ordinary place imaginable. March 2020. The world had just changed and everyone was home, and there was a particular quality to those first few weeks of lockdown where people were reaching out to each other in ways they normally wouldn't. An acquaintance from college who I hadn't spoken to in 4 years sent me a message asking how I was doing. We ended up talking for 2 hours. Her name was Diane Kessler. She had gone into nonprofit auditing, specifically forensic accounting for small religious and community organizations that lacked the internal oversight structures to catch financial irregularities on their own. She had been doing it for 6 years. She worked with an independent firm in Cincinnati called Anchor Governance Partners, which did pro bono work with community organizations that were concerned about accountability. She mentioned all of this casually, in the context of a conversation about her career. She didn't know anything about my situation. But what she said next, completely offhandedly, was the thing I had been looking for without knowing it. She said, "The hardest part of my job is that the organizations we help are almost always relieved when we find something. They've usually suspected for years. They just needed someone to say they weren't crazy." I sat with that sentence for a long time. Then I called her back 2 days later and told her everything. Not about my personal grievance, not about the wedding, not about my mother's pattern of behavior toward me. Just the numbers. The pattern in the reports. The 2008 minutes. The timeline. She asked me 3 questions methodically, and then she was quiet for a moment. "Forward me what you have," she said, "and let me make a call." What followed was not dramatic. That's the thing no one tells you about this kind of process. It is relentlessly, almost punishingly ordinary. Diane connected me with a colleague at Anchor Governance named Paul Reyes, who reviewed my compiled documents over a 2-week period in April 2020. He asked for additional materials. Specifically, I needed to request certain public records through Ohio's Public Records Act, which applies to nonprofit organizations that receive public grants. The Women's Coalition had received a state grant in 2017, which meant certain of their financial records were technically accessible. Filing those requests took 3 weeks. They came back incomplete. I refiled with more specific documentation of what I was entitled to receive. That took another month. By June 2020, I had the documents Paul needed. Paul's assessment, delivered in a 40-page preliminary report shared with me in confidence, confirmed a pattern consistent with systematic misappropriation of small amounts across multiple administrative accounts over a period of approximately 7 years. The amounts were not large by institutional standards, but the pattern was unmistakable to a trained eye. And more importantly, the $62,000 grant that the Women's Coalition had pending was specifically flagged as a concern because some of the accounts with irregularities were the same accounts through which those grant funds would flow. This was the moment I could have gone to the media.
I know that.
I thought about it. But Diane had told me something in one of our early conversations that I kept coming back to. If you go public before the institution knows, you burn the institution. If you go to the institution first, you give them the chance to do the right thing, and they almost always do, because they have no reason to protect the person who did this to them. In August 2020, Paul Reyes formally contacted St. Andrew's Church on behalf of Anchor Governance Partners, framing the inquiry as a routine pro bono governance review of community organizations during COVID, which was true and unremarkable. They were doing these reviews across several organizations in the region. He did not mention my mother by name. He did not mention me at all. St. Andrews accepted the review. They had no reason not to. It took 3 months. During those 3 months, I went to work every day. I came home to Sarah. We ate dinner and watched television and talked about things that had nothing to do with any of this. There were weeks when I barely thought about it. There were weeks when it was all I thought about. What I did not do, not once, was contact my mother, speak to her, or give any indication to anyone in her world that anything was happening. That patience was the hardest thing I have ever practiced. And then, in November 2020, Paul Reyes sent me a 3-word message. The board knows. The first thing that happened was the quietest thing. In early December 2020, a small notice appeared on the St. Andrew's Community Church website. It announced that the church's discretionary assistance fund would be undergoing a structural review and reallocation in the new year, and that the board was committed to transparency and accountability in all community partnerships. It thanked volunteers for their continued service and mentioned a new oversight committee that would be formed to supervise fund management going forward. My mother was not mentioned, but 3 days after that notice appeared, my mother resigned from the St. Andrew's board. The resignation was announced in a Sunday bulletin with 2 sentences. It cited personal reasons and time commitments. 11 people texted me about it. All 11 framed it as something surprising but ultimately explainable. Maybe her health, maybe she was tired, maybe she had taken on too much. One cousin called it, very Patricia, always graceful under pressure. None of them connected it to anything. I didn't correct them. 2 weeks later, the Women's Coalition announced that they were pausing their grant application pending an internal review of their accounting procedures. The $62,000 grant that had been weeks from approval was frozen. My mother's name disappeared from the coalition's website. Not removed dramatically, not with any announcement. Just quietly, as if a photograph had been taken down from a wall and the nail left in. That was the first real signal. Not the resignation. Not the grant freeze. The nail in the wall. She knew. She knew what was happening, and she couldn't see the shape of it, and she couldn't stop it. I want to be honest about how I felt at this point. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and stranger, something closer to the feeling you get when you finally understand the load distribution on a structure that's been cracking for years. Relief. And a kind of sadness that the crack had been there so long. January 2021. The formal results of Anchor Governance's review were shared with the St. Andrew's Board and, separately, with the Ohio Attorney General's Office, which has jurisdiction over nonprofit compliance in the state. The total amount identified across all accounts was $11,240, spanning from 2013 through 2019. The church board made the decision, entirely on their own, without any input from me, to send a letter to the congregation that February, acknowledging that irregularities had been identified in the management of the discretionary fund, that former board members had been referred to the appropriate authorities, and that restitution had been requested. The letter did not name my mother. Ohio law, in certain civil compliance cases, protects the identity of individuals during ongoing proceedings. But Millbrook Street is a small world. And the Dayton Gazette still covered the story because a $62,000 grant freeze and a nonprofit compliance referral are newsworthy, even without a name. A reporter named Lisa Chin covered it in a 6-paragraph piece published on February 18, 2021. The phone calls started immediately. Not to me. To everyone around my mother.
Her church community.
Her coalition colleagues. The people on the board who had trusted her. The neighbors who had let her chair their association's funds. Some of them came to me, eventually, because my connection to her is obvious. What I told each of them was the same thing. I can't speak to an ongoing compliance matter, but I trust the process. I said it calmly. Every time. My mother did not call me. Not once, from December 2020 through the spring of 2021. The silence was its own form of acknowledgement. She ultimately reached a civil settlement with the Attorney General's office in April 2021. No criminal charges were filed. The amounts and circumstances fell under civil compliance territory. She was required to make full restitution, $11,240, and was formally barred from holding fiduciary positions in nonprofit or charitable organizations in the state of Ohio for a period of 5 years. The settlement was public record. The Gazette ran a follow-up piece. Lisa Chin covered it again, 8 paragraphs this time. My mother's name was in paragraph 4. I was not there to see her face when it happened. That was intentional. I had no interest in watching her unravel in real time. That was never what this was. But the reversal in how people talked about her, I couldn't avoid that, even if I had tried. The cousin who had texted me, classic Aunt Patty, the morning after the wedding called me in March 2021 and spoke for 40 minutes about patterns she had noticed over the years and never named. The neighbor 2 doors down from my mother, a retired schoolteacher named Elaine Dabrowski, stopped me at my father's birthday dinner that spring and said something I've thought about many times since. She said, "I think a lot of us saw things we explained away. It's easier to believe someone is good if you can afford not to look too carefully." The Community Service Award that had been hanging in St. Andrew's hallway was taken down sometime in the first quarter of 2021. No announcement. The photograph just stopped being there. 3 members of the Women's Coalition Board released a joint statement in May 2021 acknowledging that the organization had failed in its oversight responsibilities and committing to structural reforms. They specifically said they had been too trusting of individual leadership without adequate checks. They did not name my mother either. They didn't need to. Perhaps the most quietly powerful reversal came from my father. We had dinner in June 2021, and at some point in the evening, after a long silence that felt different from his usual silences, he said, "She used to do this thing when we were married. Whenever someone in her orbit started getting too close to something she wanted to protect, she would find the small thing about them and say it out loud in a room full of people. Make them the story. She did it to me, once, at her sister's anniversary party. I never forgot it. He hadn't known about the investigation until it was over. I had never told him, and he sat with it for a while, and then he said, 'I should have done something. Years ago. I don't know what, but something.' That was the heaviest moment of the whole thing. Because the pattern hadn't just been aimed at me. It had been running for decades, and there had been many people like my father who had felt it and said nothing and left the room while she stood there with her smile and her earned authority intact. As of today, sitting with the full picture of everything that happened, here is what I can tell you about what the years since 2021 have looked like. My mother lives on Millbrook Street still. She keeps a quieter life now. She attends St. Andrew's, though she no longer sits on any committee. She gave up the neighborhood association chairmanship. The block parties on the 4th of July still happen, organized by someone else now. I am told the casseroles still get delivered when people's husbands die. I don't say this with contempt. I say it because I think people are capable of smaller lives, and sometimes smaller lives are more honest. The Women's Coalition reconstituted under new leadership. They received a modified grant of $48,000 in 2022, with new oversight mechanisms built into the terms of the award. I know this because I looked it up. Those programs still serve families in Dayton. That matters to me more than anything else in the story. St. Andrews revamped their discretionary fund entirely, partnering with Anchor Governance on an ongoing annual review basis. The Community Assistance Program now serves 410 families, up from the 340 it served before the review. They published a new annual report format in 2022 that includes significantly more line-item transparency than anything they had published before. Paul Reyes told me when we last spoke that the St. Andrews engagement had become something of a model for how they approach similar situations with other small community organizations. He said that sometimes one clean process teaches an institution how to protect itself for the next 20 years. Diane, who started all of this with an offhand sentence on a COVID-era phone call, was promoted to senior partner at Anchor Governance in 2022. I sent her a card that said, "You told me they'd be relieved. You were right." Sarah and I moved to a house in Columbus in early 2021, a bit further from Dayton, which felt necessary and was also, simply, practical. We were starting our lives together, and we needed space to do that away from the gravity of all of it. We have a daughter now. She's 2 years old, and she has Sarah's nose and my particular way of staring at things she can't figure out yet. I don't have a relationship with my mother. That is a sentence I have made my peace with, though peace is not the same as comfort. They are different things. I think people confuse them often. My father and I have dinner once a month now. The relationship we've built in the past 4 years has a quality I didn't know was available to us. Something honest. Something that doesn't require us to maintain a story about who we've been. We just talk about who we are. He's been going to therapy. At 63 years old, he started therapy. He mentioned it casually one evening the way he mentions everything, and then said he thought it had something to do with watching me handle this whole situation. He said, "You didn't let her write the ending." I always let her write the ending. I've thought about what I would tell someone younger who finds themselves in a version of this story. Someone whose home doesn't feel like the safe place it was supposed to be. Someone who has been made small, in public, by someone who is supposed to make them feel large. I don't have simple advice. I don't believe in simple advice. But I would say this: document things. Not because you know what you'll do with the documents, but because keeping records is how you honor your own experience. It's how you say to yourself, "This happened, this was real, I am not confused about what I saw." And I would say, the goal is not to destroy someone. The goal is to stop letting their version of you be the version that stands. Sarah and I talk sometimes about what we'll teach our daughter about family, what it means, what it doesn't have to mean. That family is not a permanent pass on accountability. That love doesn't have to feel like a ceiling. That the people who are supposed to hold you up are allowed to be human, but they are not allowed to use their humanity as a reason to pull you down. She's 2. She doesn't understand any of that yet. She just stares at things until they make sense. I'd like to think she gets that from me. I watched a building get demolished once, professionally, as part of a site assessment. It had been standing for 60 years. To look at it, you would not have known it was compromised. The facade was intact. The signage was still bright. The windows hadn't broken. But the foundation had been slowly compromised over decades. Not dramatically. Just the slow accumulation of neglected cracks, of loads distributed in ways the structure wasn't designed to handle. When they finally brought it down, it didn't fall the way you'd expect, dramatically, all at once. It settled. The engineers had done their work precisely. It went down floor by floor, quietly, with a kind of inevitability that made several of the observers go very still. Afterward, one of the demolition engineers said something I've never forgotten. He said, "A building doesn't lie. You can dress it up, repaint it, put a new sign on it, but the load is always telling the truth. People are different from buildings in almost every way, but not in that one. The load is always telling the truth. The weight a person puts on others, the weight they carry without acknowledgement, the weight of what they've done and not done, and explained away and reframed. It accumulates. In records. In the memories of people who were in the room. In the texture of how they're talked about when they're not present. My mother spent 30 years building something beautiful and calling it her image. What she built beneath it was the thing that finally mattered. I didn't ruin her perfect image. Her perfect image was never real. I just stopped agreeing that it was. That's all any of us can do, really, stop agreeing that the version of events designed to diminish us is the one worth living inside. The truth doesn't always arrive quickly. Sometimes it takes 18 months of patience, a 3-word message in November, and a name in paragraph 4 of a newspaper story that nobody can take back. But it arrives. It always arrives.